Hello, very beautiful community. We are going to talk about something really scary, which is the collapse of the center. Why is the collapse of the center so scary? It's so scary because when something big that you completely depend on goes away without any prospect of it being replaced by anything else, that's really difficult to process, especially by human beings who have come out of, in historical terms, a relatively stable period, say 1989 till 2014. Now, on top of the collapse of the center, we've got a specific issue that we'll be addressing in this video in the context of a skirmish that we'll legislate on between Gary Stevenson and Rory Stewart. And that's the issue of economic exclusion and inequality and discrepancy in economic power. And the problem here is that it's not about a left-wing perspective. In other words, the levels of inequality of economic power we're dealing with in our societies are existential, whether you're left-wing, liberal, centrist, conservative, whatever. Why? Because there is no way to avoid a widening perception of a lack of legitimacy to certain kinds of concentrations of economic power in the hands of a small number of people. That creates the effect that citizens who perceive this sight to behold as being illegitimate stop taking seriously that they're meaningfully part of a society to which they owe certain things. Moreover, it contributes to a huge challenge we face, which is the challenge of the dignity of labor. You don't keep your democracy unless you keep enough of your citizens feeling that the work they do is not just about them getting money and delivering some services for somebody, but it's about something bigger, that it's part of a bigger whole, that it's part of some kind of contribution to a country that's going somewhere in accordance with some kind of national project that is articulable. So, having put these things on the table, let me tell you what we're going to do in this video. We're going to say a few things about a video that Gary Stevenson recorded a day or two ago, responding to an unfair way in which Rory Stewart mentioned him on The Rest is Politics podcast many months ago, for which Rory has apologized. So what I'll do is I'll critique what Gary did, I'll critique what Rory said, but I'll do this only in the context of this wider picture of the collapse of the center, keeping an eye on what we can do about it, but also on how we can talk to each other to bring it about, that we can do something about it, because if we can't talk to each other, we can't do anything at all. So let's start with the beginning, which is that Zach Polanski, the leader of the UK Green Party, went on The Rest is Politics a few months ago and was cornered by Rory for what Rory felt was insufficient grounding in economics. And Rory got really outraged by the fact that Zach hadn't invested the time to grasp economics more deeply than he should have done. Now, is Rory's outrage proportionate or not? Let's quickly deal with this.
Tell us which economists you're listening to. Who are your intellectual influences here? brilliant people. So Grace Blakely, Richard Murphy, who's been doing a lot of work on this, Gary Stevenson, who I know you've had on recently, James Meadway, lots of different economists. So a lot of the time it's just reading the stuff that they're talking about. And I think there is a consensus that the neoliberal model has broken and it's not worked.
I understand Rory's outrage because the sentiment is very clear. You might never become prime minister, but you want to become prime minister. So you're going to be dealing with the lives of tens of millions of people. Don't you dare put them in a vessel that you haven't studied properly. Don't you dare put them in a vessel and take them in a direction without having properly written out a map. Right? That's the sense of outrage of Rory's, and it makes sense. Unless you think that Zach's grasp of economics was adequate, and I don't think it was. But I actually wouldn't have been, as a matter of personal sensibility, angry at Zach for this. Why? Because, and let's do another emotional acting out, look, the failure of the technocratic center is really bad. What do they keep doing? They keep doing things that have got us into the problem we're currently facing. Not all of where we are is a cause of bad policy. Far from it. There are many social forces nobody controls. But a lot of it is. And a lot of it is to do with certain kinds of policies that were a product of the jettisoning of liberatory credentials of post-World War II liberalism. But now we've got a situation where we've got radically mistrusting and polarized societies run by technocratic centrist governments that still want to do centrist technocracy, but you can't do it in a distrustful, polarized society because you can't tell people who don't trust you and don't trust the institutions you occupy that you're going to outsource a policy to experts and then you're going to settle it. You need to reckon triple hard, quintuply hard with the sentiment of people on the doorstep and realize that as certain things that had civic consent have lost civic consent, you can't carry on doing them, because if you keep doing things that do not have civic consent, you're simply going to lose your democracy, because all of our institutions are going to lose trust and we're going to elect Farages everywhere and they're going to try to stay in power permanently, as Orban did and failed. So centrism of a technocratic kind is not a solution, and it's even worse than this, because as technocratic centrists realize that they are assailed by the forces of authoritarianism, which we endlessly critique on the channels, they get into an even more defensive posture and everything becomes even more restricted. There is less proactive conversation and policy. There is less boldness. There is more defense rather than offense, as US Americans like to say. And that just makes the situation worse, because what we need now is a degree of radicalism and a degree of boldness. Not of an ideological kind, but of a practical kind. We've got to change a lot, right? So as not to lose everything democratically. Democratic collapse does not mean societal collapse. It doesn't mean you're going to be an apocalyptic scenario, but it does mean something really tragic, that you lose the sense that your institutions are alive and that you can kick the folks in power out of power and you can get a fair deal in the court system or in the media. So it's a life where you can still go and drink your favorite wine and you go to the opera or wherever you like to go, but you've got much less political power as a citizen. You're forced into a kind of depoliticization. So that's bad. And so my feelings here about why I wouldn't be pissed, and we've circled back now, at Zach, is when the centre lapses that badly, what the hell do you expect? People are going to come and say, what the hell is going on? People are going to come and call bullshit on the centre, and not all of them are going to be, resplendently informed on every aspect of policy. And so I see absolutely the critique of Zach at the level of personal epistemic responsibility from Rory that made Rory outraged, but I wouldn't personally be outraged, because if you don't like this or that political actor, where is the alternative? That's the version of what they are, plus with the advantages that you think are absent in them, right? And by the way, that's not an endorsement of Zach Polanski's politics. That's just an endorsement of the fact that we need to activate, right? We need political activation. We need more richness in our conversation about what our options are and where we might be going, right? And one of the reasons, even if you despise every single policy of theirs, that the Greens in the UK have surged is that they have broken out of the constricted technocratic consensus about what you're allowed and what you're not allowed to propose, and what level of boldness and clarity you are allowed or not allowed to have about your message. Now, let's get to the point of the skirmish between Gary Stevenson and Rory Stewart. Rory said to Zach Polanski, the Green Party leader, who are the economists who influence you? And Zach named a bunch of names. One of them was Gary Stevenson. And Rory said, so what, you're saying that Gary is some kind of pseudo-academic economist? And Zach said, no, he's not a pseudo-academic economist, he is an economist. And Rory said he's got an undergraduate degree in economics, which is not true because he's got a postgrad degree in economics too. And Zach said, no, surely an undergraduate degree in economics makes you an economist, which is not something you want to hear from a party leader. And then Rory answered by saying, well, where are all the graduate, and properly academic economists? What Rory was saying was not entirely clear about his distinction between somebody who is entitled to commentate on economics and do so as an expert, between somebody who is an economist but not an academic economist. For Rory, is that possible? Is that not? And an academic economist in the conventional sense, somebody who spends their time, full time, going round and being connected with an academic institution and publishing in discourse and Discord, their responses to what others in the field think, receiving responses, publishing further responses, and so on. They're part of that discursive space, of which Gary Stevenson is clearly not part, and if that's all Rory's saying, then that's okay. But it wasn't quite clear what Rory was saying, and then specifically, Rory was making a mistake when he said that there was no postgrad degree there when there was. He apologized to Gary on Twitter, but Gary, still months later, went out and made a 1 hour, 6-minute long video about it.
Consensus where? From people like Gary Stevenson, or where's the consensus? Where's the academic consensus here?
I think the academic consensus is among economists who aren't working for the government. I think they're all looking at government
you
decisions.
See Gary Stevenson as a sort of pseudo-academic economist, or a...
I don't think he's pseudo-academic. I think he's literally an economist. That's his job.
What about, you mentioned...
it's not his job. He's a city trader. He studied an undergraduate degree in economics.
Right.
Okay, he's not a professional economist.
But I think if you do a degree in economics, it's fair to say you're an economist.
Where are the people with graduate level degrees in economics that you're focusing on here? Where are the professors? Where are the people for whom this is their academic speciality?
So this underlines...
Okay, so that is Rory Stewart pretty publicly denying my credibility as an economist and disappearing my postgraduate degree at Oxford. is pretty scandalous, really.
So I made a video in response to Gary's video, and I took it down a few hours ago. So this is the substitute video. And I took it down for 3 or 4 reasons, even though the comments were a democratic calamity in a way that wasn't continuous entirely with what was wrong with my video. So what was wrong with my video, and don't worry, we'll keep coming back to the big picture issues, was that it was about 8 in the evening and I hadn't yet stabilized my health sufficiently to record. I just got there, and so I didn't have the time to cut the relevant clips out and then react to them from Gary's video. So instead I thought, why don't I just watch Gary's video for the first time, react to it as I watch it, but skip back and forth so I don't spend an hour and 6 minutes watching the video and then reacting to it perhaps for a further hour, which would not be realistic for the beautiful community or for my health. And as I did that, I clearly didn't do a perfect job of representing every part of the video. I was quite repetitive. There were bits that we watched that seemed to be similar to other bits, and I spent just time scrolling. And that created no error, but a somewhat strange disbalance of emphasis. I ended up saying several things over and over again. The second issue is that I have a very important principle, and that's that the way I understand my public intellectual work is that a litmus test for whether something I've done is adequate is if it already contains the answers to the critiques that it is going to receive after it is published. If it doesn't contain nearly all the answers, it's flawed. That's to say, that if the response raises issues that should have been raised in the video but weren't, we've got a problem. And one of the issues that was raised, I think legitimately, in the comments was whether or not there was a classist element to what Rory said about Gary, because Rory comes from a relatively privileged background and Gary is extremely privileged but doesn't come from a privileged background. And I didn't say anything about what classism might be or whether what Rory said is an expression of it. And then I think that there was a further problem. And the further problem was that because I was reacting live, I wasn't good enough at bringing things back to the big issues, what discourse we need to keep our democracy on the road. It was too much, is this thing that Gary said on minute 53 right, or is it unfair, and so on. Now, what was the disaster that occurred in the comments? The central disaster in the comments, and by the way, when I say disaster in the comments, what happens is that when comments are negative on my videos, which is very, very rare, that means that 19 out of 20 people watching are liking the video. So, in other words, negative comments do not represent what I see round the back, which is the total ratio of likes to dislikes. So for me, it was a complete collapse of likes to dislikes ratio. It went down to 95%. That's not why I took down the video. I'd be happy for it to be at 40% and keep the video. It was a close reflection for me, and I decided to take it down for the reasons I articulated. But on the actual YouTube page, it can look like every third comment is critical, and it was maybe every fourth or fifth. Now, so that's what an unpopular video looks like. There is a collapse from 99.5% average likes ratio to 95% average likes ratio. But what happened is that the algorithm gave the video limited reach, and essentially that resulted in people who hate Gary Stevenson and people who love Gary Stevenson dominating the comments. And so essentially it became Gary Stevenson is a disgrace, and how dare you criticize Gary Stevenson? This is slanderous, and you've lost all of your integrity. Which is toxic, but there we go. Now, the worst comments of all, in the sense that if you had any misanthropic dispositions, you'd just pull your hair out. I don't. But the worst comments were the following. Vlad, how dare you defend technocratic centres? How dare you defend the centre that's collapsed? And that video literally said, quote, technocratic centrism is currently, as we speak, digging the graves of our democracies. You say that in the video, and the comments are like, how dare you defend the technocratic centre? And then obviously the conclusion that follows is that this sort of discourse is a problem for our democracy. We've got a real crisis of comprehension. Now, let's analyze the classism element. So, humans, to say something dreadfully kitsch, contain multitudes within them. Politically, that's a really important observation, because we think of people as that. When we think of how they vote, they're that. But they're not that. They're that, and then there is that, and that, and that, and that, and they're a bit of a wash between all of these little cubes that I constructed. Which means you can always appeal to another side of a voter, and then always appeal to another side of the voter after that other side, and on it goes. So we two-dimensionalize the electorate, and we get scared by the electorate. And thereby we refuse to tell the electorate strong and bold things that it actually has a capacity to grasp. We, out of preemptive fear, not we as in you and I, but our political representatives, sort of fearfully deconstruct the three-dimensionality of our voters. And that's dreadful, because what happens is that the people who do get to tap into their three-dimensional aspects are the irresponsible authoritarians. So, we contain multitudes, and that means that Rory is capable of walking through Afghanistan by foot, sitting down, having dinner with an impoverished family of strangers, and taking them as damn seriously as he would take a president of a country or himself. That's a remarkable openness, and a wild kind of openness, and a beautifully confident kind of openness. Wildness means being able to receive viscerally real and extreme parts of the world, you know. Wildness is being able to sort of get transported into some very strange scene in rural Kenya and feeling totally physically at home there. Rawness is different. Rawness is just being tremendously impacted by the world, but not necessarily being able to quickly process that. So wildness is very, very beautiful. But is Rory also capable of being too quick with some people because of the nature of his background? I'd bet a bit, yeah, right? And so is this a case of Rory doing that with Gary? I don't think in the main. I think in the main it's actually Rory just getting lost in his outrage at Zach not knowing enough about the economy and wanting to be prime minister. But how you analyze this depends on what your conception of classism is. Now, you could have a completely procedural conception of classism that has no bearing on what was actually in Rory's head. And that's a plausible one, it's an available one. What does that look like? It looks like this. If somebody from a privileged background is epistemically deprioritizing somebody working class, originally working class. Whether they are deprioritizing them because they're working class or not, it still rings a little bit of classism. So that's a kind of a non-intentional state-driven way of diagnosing classism. There are other ways, but these would require us to show that Rory was a little bit extra dismissive of Gary because of how Gary presents himself. But then we've got then a new completely different problem, which is what if you've got somebody from a working class background who's also neurodiverse, and their neurodiversity might be even more palpable an aspect of how they engage and communicate than their working class background. And it's important not to confuse the two, right? And that is a big thing we've also got to keep doing in our political conversations, because a huge percentage of the population has ADHD, a smaller percentage of the population, but a significant one, has autism, and also autism with ADHD or DHD. And at the moment, we're not doing a good enough job in our societal discourse at talking to each other properly and bridging together properly. Neurotypical people, neurodiverse people need to learn to bridge better in public life. So could there have been some kind of ease of dismissiveness in the way Rory spoke that's connected with his background? Sure. But also you can construct a little bit of something that's just independent of anything that's in Rory's head. But at the same time, we've got to understand two things about the UK. Number one, class is a problem and the real issue in the UK, as well as a certain kind of post-imperial mindset. True. And we don't have enough articulacy about it. On the other hand, there's also some pathology about class. A desire to turn class into something it isn't, or make it an everything issue. And so I think it would be pathological to reduce the meaning of the exchange between Rory and Zach and the way it impacted Gary on just class. For one, because, of course, the central motivating emotion for Rory was actually outrage at Zach's lack of knowledge of economics. Then there is something else. There is a sense of proportionality about issues. That's to say, somebody asked me a question about Gary Stevenson the other day, and they said, look, is Gary an inclusive populist like Bernie or Zoran Mamdani? And I said, I think in position, yes. In disposition, I'm less sure. Because as we see from Gary's response to Rory, it's not like this. It's more, I got attacked from there, and I'm going to stand up for myself, and I'm going to say how the world looks like, and it looks like this, and not like that, and this is the point I'm going to make, and boom, 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 boom. Which is fine, but it's not like that. And you've created an us and them dynamic with Rory Stewart, who's written your beautiful blurb on the front of your book, supporting you, who's invited you to the podcast, and will invite you to the podcast again. Meanwhile, you've got Russians in Russia arguing with each other on TV and in their kitchens about whether Stalin was as bad as Hitler or the best leader anyone's ever had. That's a proper level of polarization, right? And disconnect, right? Now, I can't tell Gary how he should be inclusive toward Rory, because there is no way to be inclusive objectively. There is only a distinctive way to be inclusive. Now, what would I do if I were Gary and Rory had said something about me I didn't like, or that wasn't accurate, or that deprioritized me? I would say, well, if Rory happens to have said something unfair or even actually wrong about me, or both, I wonder what mechanism was there. Was it a slip, or was there some prejudice there? If there's some prejudice there, let me analyze it. And could there be some prejudice about certain centrist sympathies that push one to be a little bit more rapidly dismissive of certain more radical positions than one should be. Right? That's a different approach. And so where would I have gone? Well, I may have gone to Rory's remark. And look, I like Rory enormously. I think he's very beautiful. But Rory's, and I think he's also very ideologically generous. He's very receptive to other ways of thinking about and orienting oneself in politics. That's a rare quality. It's a very rare quality among soft conservatives as well. But Rory said before the 2024 US election that he thought Kamala would win, and that it made sense to bet quite a bit of money on that because it was so clear. And the question is, what went wrong there? And Rory's reckoning with that, which he's had, I'm sure, in private but also in public, was too much for me about the notion that there was an excess of optimism and an excess of sort of aspirational transcendence of realism in his judgment there. And I think that's not at all what went wrong. What went wrong was that there was a failure of self-knowledge. Rory understands very deeply and talks about, and I'm sure even teaches, what the social forces are that are undermining our democracies. That's a very important box that he's not inarticulate about. He gets it. So, what are the economic forces that are undermining our democracy? We've mentioned a few, these elements of unbelievable exclusion, right? There are also elements of the untethering of various kinds of social bonds that are untogethering us, literally. There is the state of the internet, which is radically polarizing and post-truth amplifying. There are various cultural trends and fads of atomization that make people bad at reckoning with the values of the public good and solidarity. You can fill out that box a lot. So what happened is that inside Rory, that box wasn't properly integrated with other bits of Rory. And this is not integrity in an ethical sense. Rory has beautiful integrity ethically. This is integrity in the sense of integration. Integrity in the sense of, is the ship together or is it still in two bits that need to be put together? And so the reason Rory made this mistake is that bits of him weren't properly talking to other bits of him. So it's a failure of integration. It's not an excess of optimism. And that doesn't mean that I wanted everybody to say what I was saying, which is the Trump campaign is cataclysmically incompetent and imploding, and Trump's very likely to win, because what the Democrats have put up against Trump is so relatively lamentable. I don't mean Kamala Harris personally. I mean the lack of a national project offered as an alternative, because Kamala didn't have one. Kamala actually, at an individual level, did a bloody good job, because it's tough to put somebody in that position with so little time and then to expect for them to grow. And she did. She grew. For instance, she could make speeches, but she couldn't debate. She learned to debate on a high level. So she did go, a mile a minute with growth, but she just wasn't a politician or a national project. And that's a problem. Biden had more of a national project, and in many ways, for all of his cognitive decline, was a more efficacious practical political actor, arguably, than Obama. But he couldn't talk because of the cognitive decline, which is a catastrophe in a crisis of trust. So that's a certain kind of failure to weigh certain forces of which you do have a deep and internalized understanding. So it is a form of an insufficiency of integration. It is a form of a lack of acceptance, actually. So it's not excessive optimism, it's a certain kind of lack of acceptance. So there we go, we're talking about somebody who is incredibly open, incredibly worldly, incredibly intelligent, but is still, with great access, talks to all kinds of world leaders, and great knowledge, great experience, but it's still failing to accept the reality of our world in time, right? Is accepting it more now, but it's difficult. It's difficult for a lot of different people. So that sort of thing Gary could have emphasized more in his video, to which I was responding. But instead, what Gary did is appropriately talk about political mobilization in the way the comments in defense of Gary didn't talk about. They just focused on grievance, which is depoliticized, right? And you know, if you want depoliticized politics, it's available. It's everywhere. So you don't need to starve, as it were. Please, there are many other diners serving that kind of menu. I serve a different menu here. Understand that, right? Don't give me depoliticized outrage in the comments and think I'm going to be impressed, right? So, and I do partly blame the algorithm for that, because that's how the video was pushed. But the important point is that Gary did talk about political mobilization in his video. He did talk about how do we emphasize the point that the level of inequality we have is not okay. I'm not necessarily endorsing Gary's solutions to it. That's a separate conversation. But I'm saying that the problem identified is correct. And so that was great. What was less great was that Gary failed to articulate in the way that I have just done what may have gone wrong for Rory, and what relevant lesson we can take about that, about how we feel about centrism and what kinds of bits of denial and so on thinking about centrism comes with. And Gary ended up saying sort of 6 or 7 different things that he felt Rory did wrong. The factual mistake, the pseudo academic economist remark, Rory's background, and then it was a slander and it was an attack, or then it just wasn't very thoughtful and Rory just didn't check it properly. So Gary ends the video with a much more conciliatory remark than how he speaks at the beginning. At the beginning he talks about it as an appalling slanderous attack. And then he talks about other attacks he's experienced, attacks on his privacy, which are grossly inappropriate, attacks in the Financial Times, which are not necessarily inappropriate at all. Depending on what's in them, of course, they shouldn't contain factual misinformation. And so by the end of it, nobody except a great fan of Gary's could be responsibly clear about exactly what kind of problem Gary had with Rory. I'm sorry to say that. I think a lot of people will feel, no, it's clear. It's the classist remark and Gary's outraged about it. That was one of several things that Gary articulated. I'm not saying that any of the things he articulated are wrong. I'm saying he didn't pick one, or he didn't pick a priority among them. It was a bit of a stick things to the wall situation. Why? Well, because what's brilliant about Gary is when his mind works in that way, but for a very constructive end. So how does Gary's mind work? You can take 200 things, put them on the wall, he can put them on the wall, and then he can suddenly see that thing 14, thing 27, and thing 34 are connected, and there is a pattern there. And he can spot that, whereas 99.9% of humans wouldn't, and that's his brilliance. And a lot of people's brilliance is, importantly, connected with their neurodiversity. What is much less Gary is to sort of cumulatively look at all of these things that are there, and instead of straight away finding this pattern that nobody else can see, sort of weigh up how they all sit together, how they all hang together, what the priority is. So a kind of balanced systematization of it. It's not his thing. And that's another thing that's really important in our culture. That we understand that some people's strength is your weakness, and that some people's weakness is your strength. Something can be very easy for me and very difficult for you. Something can be very difficult for me and easy for you. And we have to have humility about that in a way that says, look, some kinds of weaknesses are really difficult and we need to challenge them. But other kinds of weaknesses are less important, such that we should focus on people's remarkable strengths and elevate those, right, and praise those. And in the context of neurodiversity, in the context of ADHD, autism, and ODHD, it's very important that neurotypical and neurodiverse people are able to speak together properly. And that requires a lot of bridging on both parties, and it requires a bit of a cultural conversation about how we do that. And this is difficult on my end, because this is an issue that is either very well understood by the people who understand it or not well understood at all. And also, when you talk about neurodiversity, not in this context, but in politics, you often end up mentioning it with a negative connotation, because you don't talk about it until it impacts in some negative way somebody acting with a lot of power, because that seemingly gives you the clearest right to talk about it. Now, I have mentioned positive neurodiversity in politicians as well, but this does create a problem because, of course, Wittgenstein was autistic. Mozart had ADHD. So that's very important to recognize that if we get rid of neurodiverse people, we're going to get rid of arguably the majority of the most remarkable human output in history. So, now, I thought that there was something very diffuse, basically, about what happened, and therefore Gary's video risked becoming too much a grievance carousel. And what is a grievance carousel? It's depoliticized behavior. And so it clashed a little bit with his more mobilizing remarks about, God, we need to wake up to the fact that inequality, as it stands, is a real political problem. Now, there's something interesting that I laughed about my video, which I took down, which wasn't the reason I took it down. The reasons were the ones I gave. But it was funny. And that's that because I was reacting in live time to Gary's video, and I kept scrolling back and forth, I ended up defending Rory Stewart on this point that the central animating emotion he had wasn't dismissiveness of Gary, though there was an element of that, but it was actually anger at Zach, frustration with Zach. But I ended up defending Rory 2 or 3 times over, because the same sort of points came up and up. And I realized that I could be teased for that video being a kind of, you turn it on and there's Vlad saying, "Oh, Rory is beautiful, don't criticize Rory, nobody should criticize Rory at all." And I showed the video that I took down to a friend I really trusted, and she watched 10-15 minutes and she thought, actually, all these points are I think they're all right, so maybe keep them. But then again, I said, look, this point about a few things being raised in the comments that aren't already answered in the video is important, and the fact that it has a lack of balance and a lack of proportion in emphasis is also important. And perhaps a bit of a lack of emphasis on, the issues of big politics, because I'm too much in reactive mode, reacting to what's happening on minute 43 and so on. But I said to her, having watched bits of my video, I could be teased about defending Rory all the time in this kind of protective and loving way. But actually, this is what I want to say now, emotionally, well, when I was making that video, I felt more protective of Gary than Rory, even though I'm much more, if you like, compatible with Rory. If you sent Rory and I for dinner, we'd get on better than if Gary and I went for dinner. We wouldn't get on badly, we'd get on well, but it wouldn't be as deep a connection. But I was actually more protective of Gary than of Rory in that video, where a lot of people were angry at me for not being protective of Gary. That's because I don't really see Rory in any way as a victim of this. And also because I tend to elevate younger people. Gary's younger than Rory, Gary's younger than me. And I think of these people's future and how they can evolve and what their contribution can be. And so I was feeling protective of Gary, and that didn't come across. But I thought it was clear. Now we can't legislate on it properly because we're not going to watch that video now. But the point is that this is what we've got to take away from that. There's a gap between what one feels and what one says. There's always a risk of misunderstanding that gap. But what we need to do in our political discourse is reflect on that gap more. Politicians probably can't do it that much more because active politics, literally being a politician, is a very literal-minded business. It's a business that's all about, saying something that's a kind of football that can survive all kinds of misrepresentation. I think that's less true now in the populist age. You've got to say some more bold and more risky things, but the literal-mindedness does remain. You don't want to say something that's liable to an unfortunate misrepresentation, even though that misrepresentation doesn't bear on any truth. But other people engaging in politics have to realize that we come to the table of politics. And this is again something that could have been a useful part of this exchange between Gary and Rory. We come to the table of politics from different vantage points. Not just different political and ideological vantage points, but different ways of feeling, different ways of talking about politics, with different brains, neurotypical, neurodiverse brains. And so we've got to focus a little bit less on the surface of what people say and understand intent a bit better. And it's even worse than this because we're not just focusing on the surface of what people say, we're even ignoring the surface of what people say and focusing on just signals they emit. Oh, they've made these 2 or 3 noises, they've put together these 2 or 3 words. I don't even need to know what the wider context of this paragraph means. I am just going to say nasty things about them straight away. So we need to move from that to focus on what's actually said, and from what's actually said to what's actually felt behind what's said. Right? This is a strong and abrupt sentence, but is there an anger or a violence or something destructive behind it or not? And is the anger behind it constructive or unconstructive, right? What someone feels behind what they say is really important. Without that, you can't have a society talking to itself healthily. You descend into a kind of narcissism if you hold people responsible just for some kind of abstracted understanding of the words they've emitted. You have to understand what they feel behind the words. What are they striving for? How are they oriented? How are things hitting them? And what's their intent about how what they say should hit you, even if it doesn't hit you in the way they intend. So there is a gap between what one feels and what one says. And we don't want to attribute destructive motives to somebody that aren't there in virtue of how we make sense of what they've said. Yeah? That's very, very, very important. Right? Politics is always about a certain kind of us being negotiated amid conflict. And that means it's very, very important that there is adequate connection between interlocutors who engage in conflict. There is this very important human skill of engaging in conflict constructively. And you've got to model that skill. It's my responsibility to model that skill. More than other people who perhaps have different roles, but even people who are activists, organizers, moralists of various kinds, they do have a certain kind of responsibility, right, to model what it means to engage in conflict constructively. Right? It's not okay to say, I like this person, somebody said a bad thing about them. That's not because you're oversensitive or because you're narcissistic or because you are rude. It's because it's just depoliticized. That's not how things work in politics. That's not how politics gets done. It's consumerist, right? Comments that say, oh, this bad thing was said about a commentator I like, that's depoliticized. There's no politics in that. You're basically, expressing preferences for various actors in political life, the way you purchase things on Amazon. It's consumerist. To not think systematically about how what you're doing is or is not part of some kind of constructive change. So you can't separate a conversation, a manifold conversation about the nature of our communication, from a conversation about the collapse of the center. Because to do anything about the collapse of the center, we've got to talk about politics with one another in a way that gels and works. If we can't do that, we can't do anything. If we manage to talk to one another better, which is a very tall ask, it will be possible for us to collectively address this huge challenge that something on which we've been relying has ceased to work, and we don't currently have the skill to replace it with something else. This creates a certain kind of shrillness in tone that inclines politics to become even more cultural and even more divisive and even more apolitical, because it's hard for people to face the reality that there is a problem that you can't fix, that you therefore have to go on politically with the view that we might get closer to better solutions toward fixing this problem, not all of which are available to us now. And that state of vulnerability is very difficult for people to bear, so they shut down. And they exit the realm of thinking about politics effectively. But also don't forget, look, when you exit that realm, what you're doing actually mirrors the behavior of the people you want to beat, the authoritarian, anti-institutional people. So we've gone carouseling around enough. Tell me how this chat has hit you in the comments. That's 11 talks in.